Once upon a time, there was a young king named Sigmund. Now, King Sigmund reigned over this large kingdom, and he was very rich, and he fought constantly with all of the countries around his land, and he always won. He was the first into the battle, waving his sword high, riding his mighty steed, and wearing a great purple robe. He was preparing to attack another neighboring land when he fell ill, seriously ill. First, his doctor tried to treat him, but he wasn't getting any better. So they began to summon other doctors from the kingdom, but they couldn't figure out what was wrong. And he was growing weaker and weaker. And finally, one morning, the young king opened his eyes to see death standing at the foot of his bed. "It's time," said death. "Your time has come." No, I can't go with you," said King Sigmund. "There's too much to do. I have more lands to conquer, and I've never even married. I don't have an heir. I've got so much that I still need to do." Death sort of shrugged. "I don't care. Your time has come. There are plenty of people who'd like to be king. Don't worry." But they need me," he cried. "Everyone will tell you that. Ask any of my ministers, any of the soldiers. They all say that no one can lead like I can." Death took a step closer. "It's time." The king tried to bargain. "I'll give you money. I'll give you all of the riches I have. I'll give you my lands." And Death laughed. "I don't need money. I don't want your land." "What are you so afraid of, Sigmund? You've always been the first into battle. You've always been so brave." "I'm not afraid, but my people need me," he said. Death raised his eyebrows, if death has eyebrows. "Do you really think so?" "I'll tell you what. I'll give you a week. If you can find someone voluntarily, with no coercion, of their own volition, who will take your place, I'll let you live." Then Death disappeared. The king felt his strength come back, and he jumped out of the bed. The doctors were amazed. Of course, they were full of self-congratulation as well. But he summoned his prime minister, and he explained his conversation with Death, assuming, of course, the prime minister would jump at the opportunity to serve the king. But he explained, "I see the predicament, but I've got so much to do. No, Your Highness, I cannot take your place." But he suggested some of the other ministers might be happy to. So they summoned them, and they gradually went through all of the castle staff. They went through the soldiers, and one by one, each one told the king how they couldn't, or in some cases, wouldn't die for him. He raced through the kingdom, desperate to find someone who would take his place. And he grew more and more frustrated and to some extent confused. "But they adore me. Why won't they take my place?" On the 6th day, knowing that his time was almost up, he was riding his great battle stallion, wearing his purple robe, going through the forest. And he realized, "I've lost." He cried out, "Death, death, come for me now." And Death came riding up on a horse as well. He said, "But you've got another day, king." Shook his head and hung it low. Said, "I've lost, Death. It's no use. Take me with you." Death nodded and said, "You've learned your first lesson. But there's still more to learn, and you have another day. I'll tell you what, I'll give you a clue. Follow this path. You're going to come to a village, and on the right, you'll see a house as you enter the village. Stop at that house and ask for something to drink." "Why?" the king asked. "There is no why with me." And Death disappeared. The king rode down the path and saw the little house just as Death had described, and a young woman was sitting outside on a bench. She had a baby on her lap, and the king took off his purple robe while he was still out of sight before she made out that it was, in fact, the king coming. And he hung it on the horse's saddle and tied the horse to a tree and now approached on foot. "May I trouble you for a drink?" he said. "Well, stranger," the woman replied, "come in, it's tea time. I'm happy to give you a cup of tea. Will you start the fire while I watch the baby?" They went into the house, and he saw an old woman sitting in a rocking chair. And she asked the young woman, "Who's that?" She said, "Mother, this is a soldier, I think, and he's going to make a fire for us, and we'll give him some tea." Then she turned to the king. You've got to chop the wood first." And so he went to the wood pile, and he set up one, picked up the axe, and was terrible because he had never chopped wood before. The young woman laughed and said, "You swing the axe like a sword." She said, "Here, hold my baby." And she began to chop the wood. The king had never held a baby and looked down, and the baby reached up and pulled on his beard and gurgled at him, and he laughed, and the baby laughed. And he was struck by the innocence of the child. The woman said, "Are you a soldier of the king?" "Yes," he said. "Well, maybe you can tell me more about him. I've heard that he's very ill, and I've heard that he might die soon. Do you think he will?" He said, "Yeah, I think he probably will." "Well, I hope whoever the next king is won't be a fighter like King Sigmund. Why does he need all those wars? You see, my husband was one of his soldiers. He was conscripted, of course. He didn't volunteer for it, but they came through and swept up all the young men and took him off to one of those pointless wars, and he died. Now I'm alone with my mother and the baby, and this boy will never have a father. And I have to work to earn what little we have. And there are thousands of widows just like me throughout the land. And for what? When King Sigmund dies, I won't be sad." She told him about once when she was a child and her father had taken her to the big city. And they had seen the previous king, King Sigmund's father. And her father told her, she said, "Now look, there's a good king. History books are never going to write anything about him. He never goes and conquers lands. He never makes wars. But that's why we love him." King Sigmund said nothing. He finished his tea, thanked her, and left. And he thought, why learn this now? I've got one day left. Through the trees, though, he noticed this flash of light, and he could make out it was Death riding on his horse as fast as he could. And so he galloped along behind, and as he was riding behind and catching up, he could tell that Death was on his way to take another life. So he dug his spurs in and raced ahead, and he reached when he saw ahead of him a young girl had fallen over the edge of a cliff and was clinging for her life. She must have been picking some flowers by the edge when she slipped, and he jumped off his horse, sliding up to the edge, and reached down and grabbed her wrist just as she was about to fall. He picked her up and set her on the top of the cliff and dusted her off, and she was all shaking, and she ran. And he was like, whew. Death said, "Well, that was a very brave thing you did there. I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you another week." A week can be a very long time if you use it well, the king said. He was riding back toward the village from where he'd come, and in the distance he could see some smoke over the trees. He followed the smoke, and he soon heard a crowd shouting. They were gathered around a burning house, and he realized it was the house where he had visited, where he had enjoyed the hospitality and the cup of tea. And he saw the young woman screaming, "My baby, my baby." And people were restraining her. She was trying to break free to get into the house. And then he saw Death ahead of him at the window, about to crawl inside. He ran up, shoved Death to the ground, and dove into the burning house. He found the baby in the crib, and he lifted him out and came out. He was severely burned, fell to the ground after he handed the baby to his mother. When he awoke, Death was standing over him, and he said, "We can't go on like this. Up until now, you have been my friend. You have led soldiers into battle, and I merely needed to come behind and clean up. Now you're getting in my way, and I can't have that." The king smiled and said, This is what I was born to do, and I will fight you the rest of my life." Death laughed and said, "I like a fight, and I'll give you another year. Maybe I'll even give you more. However, you're not going to see me again. This has been far too easy. And you will no longer just be fighting me. You're going to now be fighting all of my helpers. Famine, wars, poverty, illness. This, dear king, is only the beginning." What kind of king do we serve? What kind of king do we follow? What kind of king do we lift up and worship on this day when we proclaim Christ is king of our lives? A king of wars and victories and division? Or do we follow one who fights death? Jesus, who we proclaim as our king, is wonderful counselor, the Prince of Peace, mighty God and everlasting parent. When we make him king of our lives, we find a radical new path. One that includes all of those references Elizabeth made in our opening word, a kingdom that is like a mustard seed, a kingdom that is like workers in a field, a kingdom that is like so many other things that bring people together and have at its center love and unity. Pilate couldn't see that in our gospel lesson. And so often today, neither can we. Who is your king? Who do you follow? Amen.